probably doesn't need much of an introduction. Joe reminded me that we want to just remind you that this week you'll be getting a call from the prayer team ministry that has to do with the Centennial Gifts campaign. And that should happen the next 3 days. But the real reminder is that this next Sunday night, the 11th, at 7 p.m., we'll be having a prayer service to honor those requests and to lead the congregation in prayer. So I hope that you'll be able to join us for that. Linna changed titles on me because I was going to have fun with the contrast between Newell's last week, which was in one sentence, and Linna's in 1 century, which meant she was going to have a really long presentation. But that's okay. We're looking forward to hearing from you, Linna. If you don't know, Dr. Linna Place is a social and cultural historian. She has degrees in American material culture and American studies. And she was a member of the faculty at UMKC, the Department of History, for 40 years, where she taught on local history, 19th century women history, and American arts and crafts. And I think you all know that she and her husband, Dr. Craig Place, are longtime members of Country Club Christian Church. So, Linna, we're delighted to have you, and we're in your hands.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. It's kind of the culmination of several years of working on the story of Country Club Christian Church, which can't be, of course, told in such a short time, but we'll try to do it anyway. And I will explain the change in title in just a minute. In October 1920, some 60 people gathered in the second floor room called Community Hall in the Brookside building at 63rd and Brookside Boulevard. Their purpose was to organize a new church, a new Disciples of Christ church under the leadership of Frank Bowen. Frank and Mary Bowen, his wife, were missionaries for the Disciples of Christ denomination. They had come to Kansas City in 1897. Normally that kind of assignment, and that's what it was, lasted 3, maybe 5 years. They had been here since 1897 and never left. They were spectacularly successful in their work. By the time he was ready to start the Country Club Church, he had launched 20 churches in the community, many of them names that we know. He had been observing for some time the population drift from the Northeast residential areas up around Independence Boulevard and elsewhere, and realized that people were moving south, moving west, and were particularly drawn to an area being developed by J.C. Nichols, that Nichols, was calling the Country Club District in honor of, or because of, the location. Oh, I lost my pen. I had a cute little spotlight there. Because of the location of the Kansas City Country Club, polo, golf, all sorts of things. We now know it as Lewis Park, that it's that area. And moving, let me find my pen again. It was much brighter. Or my laser pointer. And down here is where Country Club will evolve. Nichols, of course, was also a very successful entrepreneur, realtor, and he would be integral to supporting the start and building of the church. Frank Bowen said from early days on, when he was interviewed by the Star and other actually national newspapers and magazines, that he had always worked with city churches, hence the title that I chose for today. That was a term that was understood in the early part of the 20th century. And it harkens back very nicely to what Dr. Williams was speaking about last week, when he began to describe the growing split in the Restoration movement, different beliefs, different attitudes, much of which was grounded in the rural-urban dichotomy. The urban churches, the city churches, were in those early days of the century becoming important resources, important institutions, helping to move along the development of the modernizing and rapidly industrializing and urbanizing economy. The Bowens had always worked with city churches rather than rural churches. And that'll remain important to Country Club's identity. As I said, many of the people were coming from the northeast part of Kansas City, and what had really caught Bowen's eye was the fact that many of them were members of Independence Boulevard Church, at that time probably the preeminent Disciples of Christ Church in the city. A beautiful building, almost 3,000 members, perhaps even more, a leading disciples congregation, and one that would always be our parent church for lots and lots of different reasons. One of the prime benefactors or leading members of Independence Boulevard Church was R.A. Long. Long was an industrial lumber baron, very wealthy. He was a philanthropist, and for the purposes of our story, he was a devout member of the Disciples of Christ denomination, and I think arguably was the most important layperson in the denomination nationally. He held offices at the state and national levels, and was an incredibly important factor in guiding the development. He was the founder of National City Church in Washington. It was his dream to make Kansas City the center of the denomination. That didn't quite work out, but some other good things resulted. His beloved daughter, Lula Long Combs, was a nationally, internationally known horsewoman. She was the founder of the American Royal, and she married Prior Combs, the eldest son of George Hamilton Combs, at that time the minister up at Independence Boulevard, and soon to be the minister of Country Club. Long and George Hamilton Combs were very close friends, and that friendship saved Combs at a time of great distress after the First World War. Bowen, as I said, decided that the time was right. There were just too many people who were joining that new Second Presbyterian Church in the Country Club district, and he realized that the time had come to start a disciples congregation. So one of Nichols' guiding principles was that there should always be a group of businesses, of resources to support the residential areas that he was building. Crestwood and Brookside were well underway by the time our church was launched. This is the original Brookside building. And on the second floor, this cavernous community hall, which is the first place that the early congregation met. I think many of the early members would have undoubtedly agreed with a man who turned out to be a charter member, who said, if anyone had said previously that he would drive 11 miles each way every Sunday and sit through a Sunday school hour on the edge of a cornfield, I would have called him crazy. But that's what people were doing. The community, in addition to the lengthy drive, the hall itself was less than appealing. It was used by all sorts of different groups, and on Saturday night they had dances, and the floor was heavily waxed, which created some peril the next Sunday morning for people who were coming to worship. The solution to most problems was canvas curtains, dividing the room up into smaller sections for the Sunday school period, everything being pulled back for the big service, canvas covering the floor to ward off the slipperiness. It was improvised. It essentially resembled a large camp out. The chairs, and I love it that they've got them here, these wooden chairs were a source of difficulty as well. Perhaps some of you, I do, remember them from early childhood in some of the older buildings. They weren't very sturdy and had a tendency to collapse with a loud crash right in the middle of communion or the Lord's Prayer, particularly if they were occupied by someone under the age of 16. So all in all, it was an adventure to worship there. From the very first, and at the first meeting, Bowen said, who do you want to call as your minister? And from the very first, they all agreed that they wanted George Hamilton Combs to come and accept the pulpit at the new church. He had retired from Independence Boulevard a couple of years previously, He had returned from the First World War in 1918, essentially a broken man. He had gone over as a chaplain, was appalled by what he saw, the experiences that he had, and came home with real dreams of the world being a different place now. We fought that war. We know what we need to do. And when he got back, he essentially looked around and said, nothing changed. Nothing's changed at all. And it drove him finally to retire. He went to his country home with his wife, Martha, and decided that that's where they would remain. He would write, he would garden, and he would go out for occasional talks. But after a couple of years, he felt ready to resume his ministerial calling and accepted the offer from what became Country Club Church, a church that he would serve for the next 21 years. A second individual, and I've told several groups in the church about her, she's kind of fun, who was very important and there from the beginning, was Esther Darnell. Esther Darnell was a very accomplished contralto who performed widely in the city and beyond. She was also the assistant director of the music department for the Kansas City School District. She had grown up next door to the Combs up in the Northeast, and was also a member of the Boulevard Christian Church, very active member. Her leadership, and some might have added her very strong will, in the new suburban church laid the solid foundation for what I think we would all agree remains a very rich musical tradition. While the group was still worshiping in Community Hall that first year, she grew very weary of the clunky, derelict piano that had been rolled in for Sunday services and requested that the board buy a new one. The board, consisting entirely of men, and that would be the case for decades, dismissed her request with an abrupt directive to get the current piano tuned. Undaunted, she approached, as she referred to them, the ladies of the church, a translation, the wives of the board members. The new piano arrived shortly thereafter, and she conducted herself that way for many years thereafter. Combs' first sermon in January 1921 had the straightforward title of Our Program, outlining the plans and expectations for the new church. That was followed by a 4-part sermon series intended to deal with what were described as country club problems. The first of the series was entitled, Is the Country Club District Pagan? Unfortunately, nothing survives of that sermon, so we don't know what his answer was. Dr. Combs, like Mrs. Darnell, was also quite dissatisfied with circumstances at Community Hall, announcing bluntly that it simply wouldn't do and it was time to look for land to build a church. Fairly quickly, with the guidance of the Nichols Company, they decided on the plot of land at 61st and Ward Parkway. At the groundbreaking ceremony, Combs handed the shovel to the children and said, "Here, this church is for you. You turn the soil." The business of purchasing land, the construction of a church, the organization of a formal administrative structure required an active board and trustees to make significant decisions and sign contracts. The leadership was pulled together in a fairly ad hoc and informal way, mostly by Frank Bowen and a couple of the leaders in the group. One included Langston Bacon, who had been the chairman of the board at Independence Boulevard, and he now assumed that role. With the new church, they were all men. There was no system of rotation or tenure. Once you were on the board, you were on the board. And George Hamilton Combs loved adding new members. The bigger, the better. So it grew and grew and grew over the years. The Bacons, he was always called Judge Bacon. He was a justice of the peace, among other things. Moved into the nearby Brookside Hotel, which was a residential facility constructed in 1919. Board meetings were held there actually for a number of years, even after the new construction started on the church. After a number of incarnations over the years, it's been all sorts of things, including dormitory for UMKC. The old Brookside Hotel is once again an elegant residential building known as Crestwood Condominiums. The white building over to the side is Second Presbyterian, where people had started going to church before Frank Bowen decided to change that. Construction of the new church was under the direction of architect Walter Root, who was the younger brother of the Root, who was part of Burnham and Root, the famous Chicago architectural duo. Walter decided at an early age that he wanted to get out from under the shadow of his big brother in Chicago and came to Kansas City, where he remained for the rest of his life as a very successful architect. The first building was the so-called North Wing. I've got two slides here because they're kind of fun. They're among the few slides we have of construction that show people working on it. It's hard to see, and I try to, over here, is a tiny little man, but more interesting, it's the only photo that I've found from these years, a woman. When I first saw this, I thought, oh, it must be Martha Combs or Mary Bowen, but she's clearly dressed in working clothes, a heavy enfolding apron. It's hard to figure out what her role, the building's almost done. Perhaps she was helping to prepare it for opening day, clean it on the inside. She might have had some responsibilities for cooking. This seems to be some sort of trestle table down there, although one would assume that people brought their lunches to the work site. Then if we go to a slightly different perspective, and it's a clearer shot, see the man there? He's cleaning the windows in preparation for opening day. They're not stained, you'll notice right away. Those didn't come for several decades. The early windows were covered in a green glaze that let the sun in, but certainly weren't as elegant as our later stained glass windows. Like the Brookside Community Hall, it was just one big room, carefully divided, once again, they probably saved them, all those canvas curtains and hangings. Small compartments for Sunday school, pulled back for the big service at the end. At one point, the men of Country Club sawed a hole in the ceiling of the room, propped a ladder up against it, and declared that their alone space for the men's Sunday school class. They at least had a retreat. The baptismal was located for the time being in the basement. And Dr. Combs admitted some mild surprise one Sunday, not Sunday, another time, when he was doing a baptism and one of the boys remained in the pool, swimming vigorously the entire time. From earliest discussion about church design, the church leaders had agreed upon a Gothic theme, a very popular choice in the 20th century. This was a move away from the so-called auditorium style of church architecture that prevailed throughout the 19th century and was a legacy of the early revivals and camp meetings on the frontier. So on the left, that's the interior of Independence Boulevard. It used the auditorium style. And of course, on the right is us. We could do a whole other session on the implications of shape, of configuration, of how you sit, what you're looking at in a church service. It really, in many ways, dictated some liturgical changes, the way certain traditions and rites were carried out. Not such a simple decision as it might have seemed on the surface. In the early years, old habits died hard, old vocabulary died hard. Dr. Combs and all the early members continued to refer to this as the auditorium, which was a source of real confusion for me when I first started looking at records. They'd be talking about the auditorium. And what, the social hall? I wasn't quite sure what they meant, but they were referring actually to the nave, where the services occurred. There's no record at this point of how we got our name. As Carla sometimes says, a cringe-worthy name upon certain occasions. It was occasionally referred to by its location as the Ward Parkway Church, which would have been the predictable identification. Independence Boulevard Church, Linwood Boulevard Church, all very typical of disciples' congregations. A Kansas City Star article writing about the new construction said simply that the church was yet to be named. Nothing had been decided. But somewhere along the way, the informal designation of Country Club Christian Church was quite literally written in stone. The church sanctuary was completed in 1926, the same year the Christian began publication, our newsletter. Dr. Combs' tenure, oops, here it is, almost finished. I like this because it doesn't have the bell tower. The full church then was dedicated in 1926. Dedications were something else. They were fundraisers. It was a service, but they brought in some well-known clergyman who was good at extracting dollars from those seated in the pews, and people would stand up and make their pledge towards the church debt that had been incurred thus far in front of God and everyone else who was there. Not something probably that would be so comfortable today. His tenure, as I started to say, spanned 20 very turbulent years, the roaring 20s and then the economic catastrophe of the Great Depression. Kansas City during that time was variously referred to as a wide open town, or more to the point, Tom's Town, after Tom Pendergast, whose political machine maintained tight control of the city. One of Pendergast's strongest opponents was Rabbi Samuel Meyerberg, who's on the left, very cleverly holding for camera view a book entitled Missouri Waltz, which was written by Maurice Milligan in the center. Milligan was the prosecutor who finally sent Pendergast to prison, to Leavenworth. And he came out a broken man. That was the end of the Pendergast career. But Meyerberg was a ferocious campaigner against Pendergast and against the machine. And among his strongest allies were the club women, women who were highly organized in a number of different clubs in the community and had learned to be that way before they got the vote just a few years previously. They were his staunchest allies, and many of the women were members of Country Club. Meyerberg and Combs developed a warm friendship that was the foundation for a very strong relationship that maintains to this day between our church and the Kansas City Jewish community. Much of the church's focus during those years was on membership growth and financial stability. But even during the hard times of the 1930s, the Country Club was beginning to assume a leadership role in the community with important social and community issues. Dr. Combs retired in 1942, shortly after America's entry into World War II. His successor, Warren Grafton, brought very welcome organizational and administrative skills and presided over the church during the turbulent war years. He showed particular concern and compassion for the men and women in uniform. Their letters and reports back home were published regularly in the Christian, as were notifications of injuries and deaths. When the chancel was remodeled after the war, it was dedicated as a memorial to the 10 Country Club servicemen who died during the war. As Protestants, we, I think, often assume that iconography and symbolism is not that important, the material culture of religious belief, that it doesn't really have that significant a role in our worship practices. But Country Club's interior is an explosion of color, form, and objects, many of which, certainly in our case, celebrate the Last Supper, the central rite of the disciples' worship. When the new chancel was built, there were 3 pieces of what were called liturgical furniture. Dr. Grafton is standing behind the pulpit, the communion table, and then the lectern. And those of you who've been around long enough remember that it was all switched. The pulpit is now moved over to the other side of the chancel. But those pieces of furniture, which were presented as a memorial by A.E. Mosher in memory of his wife, they're all carved with Christian and Byzantine symbols, reminders of the visual literacy that really prevailed in eras gone by 1,000 years ago. Symbols like the grape, the vine, the ivy, the pomegranate are all closely keyed to specific meanings and specific religious assertions and beliefs. And they all appear in the wooden furnitures, as they're called, in our chancel. Communion is always important. The chancel window is the story of the Last Supper. The symbol of the disciples of Christ is the chalice, and we sing from the chalice hymn. But there are other symbolic and iconographic pieces in the church as well. Perhaps, like me, some of you have sat on a Sunday morning trying to discern exactly what the images are in the two panels. They're identical. They're the same ones over the doors to the right and the left of the chancel. All the time, of course, paying absolutely close attention to what's being said in the pulpit. These are the four evangelists who are symbolically depicted in a very traditional way that can be found throughout Christendom, throughout the world. To the far end is Matthew, who is depicted, they're all winged. Matthew is the only one who's depicted as a human being, because the book of Matthew opens with Jesus's human genealogy, the begats, his descent from David and beyond. Next to him, the winged lion, Mark, a winged ox, Luke, and finally the eagle, John, the spiritual one soaring to the heavens. Grafton oversaw the establishment of programs, services, classes for returning veterans, many of whose lives were forever changed by the war. The church had become an anchor and a place of gathering in the expanding neighborhood. From the pulpit and in the Christian in the spring of 1944, Dr. Grafton announced that when news of the much anticipated invasion of Europe began, no matter what the hour, the church doors would be unlocked. And very early in the morning of June 6, 1944, the doors were opened, inviting all to a time of prayer and celebration. But he cautioned that it was too soon to celebrate. The war wasn't over. And he was right, it went on for a full year. But on a warm August afternoon, on August 15th, 1945, the church chimes rang out across the neighborhood for 45 minutes. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. Dr. Grafton was succeeded by Ewart Weil to lead the congregation that had grown to over 3,000 members. Weil was charismatic and very popular, but his tenure ended abruptly after 5 years as a consequence of his relationship with the young director of religious education. It was a painfully disruptive episode that resulted in a very important year-long organization study committee examining every aspect of church life. In 1959, the committee produced a number of findings relating to organization and administration. Among the most significant was the recognition that it was long past time for women to assume formal leadership roles within the church. By the early 1960s, women were serving as deacons and elders and would eventually chair boards and all the committees. Lawrence Bash arrived at Country Club in 1960, just in time to oversee the completion of the George Hamilton Combs Memorial Chapel, begun during Dr. Weil's ministry. Despite Bash's initial concerns that the chapel wasn't going to be used very much, he really wasn't very positive about the whole thing. It's acquired a place of importance, not only for the church, but for the larger community. The church has served as the location of interdenominational services during Lent. It was the scene of somber overflow services throughout Monday, November 25th, 1963, after the assassination of President Kennedy. And it's been the site of countless weddings and funerals. The chapel was often the site of one of Dr. Bash's particular interests, ecumenical exchanges and dialogues with clergy from many different faith traditions. Ecumenism was given full display in March 1964 during the Holy Week visit of Martin Niemöller, who was one of the major clergymen of the 20th century. At that time, Niemöller was the president of the World Council of Churches. He was a German priest, a Lutheran pastor from Germany, who had been imprisoned for 7 years in the concentration camps, one of them Dachau, for his resistance to Hitler. His experience resulted in a dramatic acknowledgement of his own failure to reject Hitler and Nazism early on. He spent the rest of his life advocating for pacifism, atonement, and reconciliation. On the final day of his visit to Country Club, he was there for the full week. Niemöller was asked if he'd be willing to go down to the social hall for some coffee and conversation with all of those who, it was overflow crowds, all those who had come. Many Protestant ministers were present, but what had not been expected was the arrival of 3 Kansas City Roman Catholic leaders, the Archbishop, the Chancellor, and the Vice Chancellor of the diocese. Relations between Protestants and Catholics had been cool, bordering on hostile in the post-war era. It's hard for us to understand, but very true. Dr. Niemöller responded to the moment by talking about the spread of the ecumenical movement among Catholics as well as Protestants. A delighted Dr. Bash, he was just over the top about all this, wrote everywhere, but in the Christian, it was my pleasure and privilege to introduce a president of the World Council of Churches to a bishop of the Roman Catholic Church. And that bishop later saw to it that when Dr. and Mrs. Bash traveled to Europe, they had an audience with the Pope. The war in Vietnam, the Cold War, assassinations, racial crises, and the civil rights movement all shaped the 1960s and the very core of religion in America. In the eyes of many, Kansas City, a deeply segregated community, was a tinderbox ready to explode. The explosion came with the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King on April 4th, 1968. Protests and riots erupted across the country. At first, it seemed as though Kansas City might avoid the violence occurring elsewhere. Over Palm Sunday weekend, there had been over 15,000 people here in Kansas City who participated in a nonviolent march. But when KC School District students planned another march for Tuesday, the day of Dr. King's funeral, the school board rejected the plans. What followed was a week of violence and confrontation with local police, National Guard, and the State Highway Patrol. 2 public officials who were most visible during that week were the mayor, Ilis Davis, and the chief of police, Clarence Kelly, both of whom were very active members of Country Club. Davis attempted to mediate and offered to march with the students to City Hall, but was prevented from doing so by the police, who made it very clear that was not going to happen. Assessment of Kelly's actions are mixed. The police responded with tear gas and mace. Kelly went on to have a distinguished career as director of the FBI. Reflecting on the events of 1968, some years later, he acknowledged his own changed position and publicly apologized to Alvin Brooks, one of Kansas City's leading civil rights activists and a regular guest speaker at Country Club, saying, I had to go to Washington and then come back before I understood what he, Brooks, was talking about. Events throughout the world were never far removed from church and community. The seemingly endless war in Vietnam continued, and the Christian once again printed the letters and accounts from young members in uniform. The conflict bitterly divided the nation. In May 1970, a student protest at Ohio's Kent State University turned violent when the National Guard opened fire, killing 4 students and wounding others. Within days, campuses across the country erupted, and at KU in Lawrence, an 18-year-old bystander, not part of the protest, who was a member of Country Club Christian, was shot and killed. In the final decades of the 20th century, traditions that shaped the rhythms of the year. Dr. Bash's regular sermon on the steps with the children started as a very cautious experiment, but soon grew into a weekly expectation. Colorado Family Camp, long since renamed Community Camp, where everyone is welcome, remains a much anticipated experience for several generations of church families. The men's interfaith dinners, founded by Dr. Bash, was an annual opportunity to bring together Protestant, Catholic, and Jew. 1975 marked the 10th anniversary of the hanging of the Greens. Baby Dedication Sunday, an occasion with origins in Jewish tradition, was the high point of Mother's Day and Christmas Sunday. Lent, once a minimally observed part of a disciples' calendar, had grown into a liturgically rich season that offered times for reflection and for sharing with fellow Christians outside of the church. By 1980s, while social justice issues and political and international events remained central to church dialogue, there was a perceptible expansion of attention to individual spiritual and psychological well-being. Aging, alcoholism, factors influencing and often disrupting family life, the evolving conception of what family actually means, when life begins, and how it should end. All these were addressed by ministers and congregants alike. There was an expanding counseling ministry, first under the direction of Dr. Daniel Fielder, and then for 33 years, led by Dr. George Gordon, who addressed challenges of contemporary life. The decades prior to and the beginning of the 21st century were a time of exploration and the posing of profound questions about what the church should mean. Dr. Eugene Bryce, Bash's successor, seen here, spoke of the diversity of belief and faith practices that existed even among members of the same very large congregation, and acknowledged how difficult it was to achieve a unified point of view. That diversity could become a source of misunderstanding, even contention, as various groups formed new classes and modified worship traditions. Yet another contemporary issue received special focus in the late 1980s with the recognition that fully 1/3 of the congregational membership was single, and their spiritual, social, and emotional needs were not being addressed. This was a new concern for an institution that had historically focused on the traditional nuclear family, and for the first time, a ministry to singles was approved by the board to be led by an ordained minister. Reverend Carla Adey, newly graduated from Yale Divinity School, was hired and began an energetic and highly successful program. Her work merged with the focus of Dr. Robert Cuny, who arrived as the sixth minister in 1991. He had realized early in his career an interest in developing healthy marriages. Together with Reverend Adey, they created a nationally recognized marriage preparation program called Great Start. When Dr. Cuny accepted the position of president of Lexington Theological Seminary, his successor, Glenn Miles, was installed as senior minister. Glenn continued that discussion. What should the church be? What should it do? And argued that churches need to learn to retradition while not abandoning the core identity of Christian faith and practice. The Miles family retraditioned by choosing not to move into the parish parsonage, but rather into their own home. The parsonage had been lived in by the Bashes, Bryces, and Cunys, but it was already a somewhat outmoded custom to have a dedicated residence for the minister. Ministers, clergy wanted to have equity in their own homes, and those with school-aged children had very real concerns about their location. Retraditioning meant reaching out to all. Inclusion meant sometimes challenging discussions about race, gender, sexual orientation, and age. Small group gatherings in 2016 affirmed the church's openness to same-sex marriage and ordination of LGBTQ individuals. But then the committee pointedly asked itself, does the community at large know that we feel this way? That same year, Dr. Miles also organized a senior ministers task force on race. Outreach has always been central to the mission of the church, even in challenging times. We have a very good track record where the rest of the country, 8% or 20% of the congregation is committed to volunteering, missions, and so forth. Ours runs at the much higher, 33%. India, Nicaragua, local ministries, and my head is right above the pumpkins there. Glenn with a little boy in a South Africa trip. It's an important part and central both to the adult ministry and that of the young people. Retraditioning was further realized when Reverend Carla Adey, now executive minister, was called to the pulpit in April 7th, the first female senior minister in the church's ministry. The announcement at Sunday's service was greeted with enthusiastic applause. Reverend Adey had spent her entire missionary, 28 years, at Country Club. At the conclusion of her installation service on September 24th, 2017, she offered her first benediction as senior minister. One of the first tasks she identified was planning for the church Centennial in 2021. The Centennial Task Force outlined an ambitious agenda that would honor the past and plan for the future and undertake a major capital campaign. Board meetings and the agenda of the church in general were guided by the vision of ministry that provided direction and goals. It was an orderly, exciting beginning for the new ministry. And then everything changed with the swiftness and ferocity of a Midwestern tornado. The worldwide COVID pandemic swept across the country, closing schools and churches, shaping work patterns, disrupting all that had been familiar and usual. Like most of the country, the church initially assumed a shutdown of, a few weeks, maybe a few months, and of course went well beyond a year. Country Club adapted, strong programs, polished Sunday services, attendance actually increased. Support programs were launched. New strategies for creating community without proximity gradually took hold. We're still seeking answers. The questions asked, the vocabulary used to frame the questions have changed through the years, but the fundamental issue behind the questions remains the same. What does it mean to be church? Last week, Dr. Williams used the term do church. To be church and to do church are two sides of the same coin. One cannot exist without the other. Church has always been more than worship services, but to be church has first and foremost been grounded in worship, preparing us to do church in the community. In his examination of mainline congregations that have experienced significant renewal in recent years, Dr. Cuny concluded that one important factor has been a thorough understanding of the congregation's story and the ability of the leadership to incorporate the church's story and sense of identity into a new story of change and renewal. This then is our story. 100 years ago, George Hamilton Combs pondered the same questions. He couldn't predict the future, but understood the constancy of change and new life. As a child of the rural 19th century and the owner of a country retreat in eastern Jackson County, he was accustomed to observing the rhythms of the natural world and often employed those images in his writings and sermons. Sowing did not mean reaping exactly what was sown. The hundreds of daffodil bulbs he planted over the years did not appear as bulbs the following spring, but as beautiful flowers. Nor did those blossoms always grow precisely where he had planted them. They multiplied and sometimes appeared in unplanned spots with the assistance of the animals who shared their space. How will we be and do church? The question will continue to be posed with an evolving understanding of the tasks that are set before us in this time and this place. Winnie.
Thanks, Linna. I sent out a chat a moment ago and already got a response. And just if those of you who didn't read it, if you want to ask a question, if you'll just put it in the chat, I'll fetch those and ask Linna on your behalf. So Linna, here's the first one. How much of the physical church building had been planned when the first portion was constructed?
That the so-called north wing and the sanctuary. That was the church that everyone had in mind. And then bit by bit over the years, we've added on and added on and added on.
All right. And could you talk a little bit more about the role of the church during the two world wars?
Well, we didn't exist during World War I, but World War II, it was Grafton's leadership. His whole soul resonated with the young people who were in the service, and he was deeply concerned about what was going to happen when they came home. So he went to great lengths to organize Sunday school classes that would be right for them, that would help them. As far as during the war itself, all you have to do is go through the Christian and look at the food drives, the clothing drives, the various fundraising efforts, people who were going down to the train stations and welcoming the trainloads of soldiers going through. It's a very moving experience to read those rather dry documents and see how profoundly the church did respond.
This one's from me. Is there, like, I can't even imagine the list of things that proverbially blew you away, but I wonder what would top the list, one or two things maybe that were just maybe the most surprising or the most pleasant discoveries.
Well, I got very caught up in the World War II era with Dr. Grafton and his response to it. But some of them, of course, are funny. One of the things that surprised me, if the question, I guess, had been what were some of the really big problems in the early days, it wasn't finances, and it wasn't because they had all that much money, actually. But no one was cooking the books or doing bad things. It was their inability to decide who was in charge. The board was composed of very powerful, often very wealthy men who were not about to leave or get off. They undercut the minister. Grafton left, actually, to profound regret of the congregation. They had all sorts of efforts launched to try and make him stay. But a rogue group of board members had started, bullying, for lack of a better word, the choir director, who's a very accomplished man, but kind of shy and, just not one of the guys. And none of this was known to Grafton. They would take him out to lunch at a very elegant place in town and tell him how badly the choir had done the Sunday before, and they wanted this changed. And finally, the choir master wrote a letter to Dr. Grafton, said, "I've changed everything I can, and I'm out of here." And that was the end for Grafton too. He decided that somehow a line had been drawn in the sand. That was a surprise to me. And it was only after then the scandal that surrounded Dr. Weil's departure and that study committee came out that they came up with rotation, job duties. There were something like 82 subcommittees in existence when they started looking. That's not an efficient way to do things.
Was there really a bowling alley in the basement?
I don't know, and I wish somebody could help me on that. I don't think so, but don't take me to the wall on that. I still haven't really figured it out. A lot of the vocabulary is confusing. As I said, they all kept referring to the auditorium in early records, and I didn't have a clue for the longest time what the auditorium was. It was the sanctuary. I don't think there was a bowling alley.
What role did the church play in the civil rights movement? Because you mentioned Mayor Davis and Chief Kelly, but were there other specific involvements at different stages, different ways?
And it was a very tight rope that many people walked. And I think that there was a lot of controversy in the church between those who wanted to do a great deal more in the civil rights movement and those who said, we have to go slow, we have to go slow. Excuse me. The neighborhood, the covenants that were a legacy of Nichols' plans for the country club district, all were part of that discussion. One thing that happened that I think a lot of people don't know now was that during the Holy Week riots that Sunday, none other than Calvin Trillin, the New Yorker writer, who is, of course, from Kansas City, came back home for a visit, and he came to Country Club, came to the service, unbeknownst to just about anybody. And a couple of weeks later, there was a very long article in the New Yorker talking about Dr. Bash's sermon, what he did and did not say about the riots. Bash was not happy with it at all, but that was one of those times when national attention bounced back on the church.
When was the organ that we have today installed, and is there any documentation as to how it was chosen?
Yeah, actually, we've had quite a few organs. The last one, oh dear, and I should know this. There was a new organ during the Grafton remodel, the chancel, and then that finally moved on in the world. I'm fuzzy, and I'm sorry. I'll get back to you, as they say in the White House. A new organ was installed later, I think in the 60s or 70s. All of our organs have always been very high end, paid for by people who wanted to make a memorial. Lula Long Combs, to shift a little bit, bought the organ for the chapel. And Mrs. Combs, number two, Martha Combs, died after surgery for appendicitis in 1924. And George remarried Gladys Gwynn, the church organist, about 3 years later. And Lula gave the organ in honor of her husband prior and the first Mrs. Combs, but the second Mrs. Combs played the organ at the memorial recital. It was a family affair.
When were the stained glass windows installed?
In the late 40s. They're spread out over a period of time. They were all designed, well, not all, the big ones down the side are designed by a man named Connick, who was probably the greatest stained glass window designer in the country, and certainly had an international reputation. And they're all memorials. They were all paid for by families in honor of loved ones.
Can you tell us about the unfinished pool?
The unfinished pool, as in swimming pool?
Well, that's the question. I guess it really is unfinished.
No, I can't. There was some swimming in the baptismal font, which apparently accommodated small children. I don't believe there was a gymnasium in the basement that they got rid of almost immediately because it was just the stone walls, and the kids were always hurting themselves badly, running up against the walls. I don't think there was a pool. There was a pool up at Independence Boulevard, and it was the renown of the city.
Somebody asked this question, and I had the same question because I started thinking about the bicentennial history, which you will not write, Linna. But some churches are really good about historical archives and preservations, others not so much. The question submitted is how much primary materials did you have to work with? But I'm also wondering, how well are we documenting now compared to what they documented?
Oh, that's a good question. Our primary resources from the early days are just unbelievable. You asked earlier what blew me out of the water. The meticulous minutes. Everybody kept careful records of the Sunday school classes, and I neglected all of that. The Sunday schools tonight, there just wasn't time. I'm a little worried, frankly, about the kind of record keeping that's going on now, because of course it's all computerized, which on the one hand is a good thing. A lot of the personality is lost. There's a real transition from, let's say, the first 40 years of these kind of goofy handwritten documents that say everything and talk about everyone, to now these very pristine, almost no information. I were joking. We had a meeting and the cookies were good. They're not very rich, and that bothers me. The other side of that, then, of course, is the preservation, and I hope very much that's going to be one of the consequences of the renovation, the capital campaign now that we're doing, that we're going to get some appropriate storage facilities, because that kind of paper and other, particularly the photographs, I'm very worried about. They're not going to last much longer.
Most of the senior ministers have been significant pulpiteers. When did the church begin to develop a multiple staff of clergy associates?
It was a while. I would say that, well, certainly Dr. Combs and Dr. Grafton pretty much wrote it alone. From the beginning, there was always a director of religious education, and that was a post that was taken very seriously. Then probably by the time Dr. Bash came along, they started expanding. That's when the pastoral counselors and other individuals with ministerial responsibilities came into being. From the beginning, we did have an administrator, an amazing man named Charles Rouse, who was there forever, about 40 years. And I think he's the one who kept the church afloat those early years when the board was so out of control.
Katie Allison doesn't really have a question, but she says that she talked with Trillin at the Truman Library function when the Homes Association was getting ready for their 100th.
Oh, yeah.
She asked him if he'd like to write his memories down, but he hadn't lived in the district. He had to live south of Gregory because he was Jewish.
Right. Yes. And he came to our church service. That was what was so interesting about it. Yeah. No, and those covenants, they were written in cement for years. And even when they weren't written, they still prevailed.
Well, Joe reminded me to mention the book that you have worked so long and hard on. It'll be finished and available late in the summer. We don't know exactly yet when we're going to have the signing and the celebration of the book, but it will be later this summer, maybe in early fall. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, Linna, or Joe, for that matter.
It's been a labor of love. It's really been a joy to work on it, and just so much fun finding out funny things, silly things, sometimes some very sad things, but it's a remarkable institution, and there has truly been a consistency in its story, to use Dr. Cuny's words.
Well, I know we'll have an opportunity as a congregation to thank you, but I want to thank you on behalf of those who've joined tonight, some 70 people. So there was a lot of interest, and you did a fantastic job sharing our story. So thank you very much. You'll just have to pretend you're hearing virtual applause. And we just got the question, will we have a book signing? Yes, we will have a book signing. We just don't know exactly when. So as far as Monday night classes go, we are taking off next Monday, but then on the 19th, we'll do a 3-part on the saints of our time. The first week is Frederick Buechner, and then Barbara Brown Taylor, and then Mary Oliver. So I hope that y'all can be a part of one or all of those. And also, if you want to participate in the spring Life Worth Living course, that'll be offered again on Wednesdays this time, starting on April the 14th. And so you need to sign up for that by next Monday. So again, Linna, thank you so much. And thank all of you for joining us. We appreciate it very much.
It was fun.
Go in peace, everybody.